My name is Srivastava, and I'm a professor at the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley, and I'm the chair of this panel. I want to start by, first of all, thanking Mike, Jim, and Laura for inviting us to participate in this conference. It's been terrific already, and I really look forward to hearing everyone's thoughts on this panel, which is designed to take a little bit of a step back from the topics we've been covering so far, and to think about the broader social, cultural, and policy implications of some of the new technologies that we've been talking about over the course of the conference. And we're going to come at this from some very different vantage points. So in just a minute, I'm going to invite my fellow panelists to briefly introduce themselves. Unfortunately, one of the panelists, Julie Shaw, had to cancel at the last minute because some childcare coverage she had been planning on fell through at the last minute. So what I have found is a short, like 5-minute long YouTube clip of Julie talking about some of her work. And when we get to her portion of the presentation, I'll just share that video so you can get at least a feel for the kind of work she does, which I think is really fascinating and has profound implications for the future of work. But Jeff, maybe I could ask you to introduce yourself, and then Diyi, you could go next.
Okay, well, thank you, Samir, and to all the organizers. My name is Jeff Hancock. I'm a psychologist that works at the Department of Communication here at Stanford. I run the social media lab here, and I'm interested in how technology changes the way we think of each other, behave with each other, and study things like trust, emotion, and language. Looking forward to hearing everybody.
Perfect. And Diyi, do you want to go next?
Hello, everyone. I am Diyi Yang. I'm a computer scientist at the College of Computing, School of Interactive Computing at Georgia Tech. My work focuses on natural language processing, machine learning, and computational social science. So basically, I study how people use language to accomplish different types of social goals, such as persuasion, and also in different kind of social contexts.
Terrific, thanks, Diyi. So here's the structure of our session that I'd like to propose. The order of the presentations that we're gonna cover is starting first with Jeff, then I'll show you the brief video of Julie's work. I'll go third and Diyi will go last. At the end of that, the three of us who are on the panel will just comment briefly on each other's presentations, and then we'll open it up for everyone else to weigh in with your comments. And Mike is going to help us in moderating the discussion. So with that as the background, let me hand it over to Jeff.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay. All right, can everybody see the slides okay? All right, great. Seen some good nodding. So today I'm going to talk about something that I got interested in while on sabbatical a couple years ago, and it's work with my colleague Moore Naman and Karen Levy and Malta Young, who are all at Cornell, where I was for 13 years. And the basic idea is that rather than thinking about how we interact with AI, or make decisions with AI, rather how AI is sitting in between humans. And so what happens when AI is involved in human-to-human communication? And we see this more and more, and I'm going to show you some examples and you'll find them to be quite similar. But here's one example of where this can take place. Imagine you're going to go stay somewhere at Airbnb, you know, once the pandemic ends and we can actually travel once again, and if Airbnb still exists, and you're trying to look at whether you should stay at Rick's place. And you will read this a little bit and you'll very quickly make a number of decisions. And one of them is whether you think Rick is warm or trustworthy. Does this seem like somebody that you'd be willing to risk staying at? And we do that in an automatic kind of way. We use it by analyzing the language very quickly and using some of the signals in there to make sense of whether you think Rick is a trustworthy person. But if I told you that in fact Airbnb had developed a new system that allowed people to just enter in a few words about themselves, and then some AI at Airbnb would write a nice paragraph for them. And that paragraph would be written in a way that Airbnb knew would lead to Rick coming across as trustworthy. So good spelling, but also the way that they were writing. You can model, different kinds of discourse that's trustworthy. We'll talk about what that looks like in a bit. And voila. So now Airbnb has written the profile for Rick. Can we still use that information to decide whether we trust Rick or not? What happens to trust, for example, when AI is the one doing the communicating on our behalf? I think this is an important change in the way we think of technology. For a long time, my world was called CMC, computer mediated communication. And starting in the 70s, social scientists were researching what happens when technology is used to take a message from one person to another. And in that case, the technology is just moving messages around for us. And it really was transformative in many ways. It could be sending text back and forth in real time. They could be copied. They could be shared. You could be communicating with dozens, even hundreds of people in the 70s and 80s. And now, of course, we've seen how that's transformed the way that people communicate. Here, what we're seeing is that the technology is no longer just a mover around of messages, but it actually operates on those messages. It can even generate messages, creating them from scratch, or optimizing them for some kind of outcome, like I want to come across as smart as possible, as sexy as possible, as dominant as possible. And so I might ask my AI to do that on my behalf. And so that's what we have now, is AI mediated communication instead of computer mediated communication. And this is how we're defining this. We kind of think that it's, if not a new field of study, certainly a subfield of a bunch of related places. Interpersonal communication is what we tend to focus on in our research. And it's some kind of communication between individuals that have been, optimized, augmented, or maybe even generated from whole cloth by algorithms to achieve some specific communicative or relational outcome, to get you to trust me, to think that I'm really nice, or that you would be wise to buy my product. And lots of different reactions. The most common, most people experience is smart replies. Google innovated this a couple of years ago in their Gmail platform. This is Maurice, who was one of the PhD students and the lead author on the main study I'm going to show you. And you can see here, he said, to his advisor, Moore, let me know what you think of my dissertation proposal. And for Moore, his responses to it that the AI suggested looks great. I think it's perfect, right? And one of the things that we've found now is that the smart replies are much more positive than human replies. And if you're Google, it makes sense. If you're going to screw up that asymmetry, better to be more positive than too negative. But we're starting to do research in this to look at what are the effects of having overly positive language. And I'll tell you a little bit about that towards the end. We see it on LinkedIn. So LinkedIn does basically what I was showing you with the mocked up Airbnb. It will take information from your resume and then write a paragraph for you, in part because people find these paragraphs really difficult to write. But here is what Maurice's looked like when he had LinkedIn do that for him. And we can always go out further to, say, the Google AI assistant, which can speak completely on your behalf. So we just see this again and again, over and over, so much more, where we see examples of AI operating on our language invisibly to the other person, at least. All right, and I'm unable to see the chats, I think, while I'm in this share screen. So if anybody wants to just shout them out, you can also feel free to shout them out too. So I'm going to show you one study of a bunch that we've done. We'll do a little bit of a deep dive on this, and I'll just talk a little bit about the rest. And we're going to focus on trust. So if AI is involved in my communication, does it make you trust me differently? And so we're going to go to the Airbnb example, and we can say, well, if for judging Rick, if Airbnb used a machine to write that for him, maybe it doesn't matter. It's just, we're going to use those cues the same way. Our old brains will be looking at this very kind of new media, just make the old decisions. Maybe they'll be more trustworthy because the AI, is going to do a better job than Rick could have done. Or maybe less, because I don't understand what's going on and what this machine's doing. And these language signals I've used in our society has sort of evolved to make sense of trust have been disrupted. So it's all on the table. Here's the study. You're going to do exactly, we got about 600 MTurkers to do exactly what I asked you to do before. How trustworthy do you think this host is? And we did that either by saying, here's the host, or we told them this is a generated profile. And we asked some people that were control group, typical, like, what do you think of this? Versus it was generated by AI. When we said it was generated by AI, we would say, this is what it would look like. It would go to your Facebook profile, soak up all the information about you, and then write something that represented who you are based off of your social media profile. And so this was not true. We're going to actually look at all of the profiles I'll show you were real ones that we got from Airbnb from other large project. We collected about 4,000 of them. But people in our treatment condition thought this is how they were generated. Okay, we had 10, and I've ranked them here from left to right in terms of how trustworthy they were. Over on the left there, profile number 1, you can see scores very high. And you can see why. They're right here. We own and manage several vacation rental properties. We're always readily available, anything at all during your stay. Trustworthy. Over on the far right, one that's very poorly rated is I am Sharma, a simple and single guy. Monday to Friday, I like to stay busy at my work, and Saturdays and Sundays are party night, right? So that guy just didn't get trusted. So people were using these cues to say, yeah, Sharma is not as trustworthy as the people with the rental properties. Okay, so what happens when they think that those profiles were generated by a machine, that AI wrote these? Nothing. It's almost identical. So they're making the same decisions. So they come in, they see the regular one, boom. They come in and see a generated one, and they say the same thing, exactly the same. Now, the two conditions, they knew everybody was all either just regular or they were all generated by AI. So there was no sort of mixing it up or anything like that. So our next study, what we want to do is look at it where you don't know anything about AI. You've been told it's AI. So control and labeled are what we just looked at. Or you're told, hey, there's going to be some AI generated ones in here, but you don't know which ones. And the last one, we're going to get them to think about it and be like, do you think this was AI, on a scale of 1 to 10? And then what do you think about how trustworthy this is? And what we can do is look at how that affects their interpretation. So control group, same. This is the second condition in the treatment condition, the first study I showed you. Here, they know that AI is doing some of them, but they don't know which. And finally, we really get them to focus on thinking about whether this was written by AI or by a human before answering the question on trust. And we picked profiles that really seemed very AI-like and very human. So we did this in a pilot study, but basically AI profiles are very straightforward, simply written. Human profiles tend to have like a little bit more jazz in them, a little strange punctuation, etc. So they're, again, all written by humans, but some get perceived very much as if they're written by AI. All right, here's what we find. If you look over on the left in the control side, you can see that the AI ones, they do well. And nobody knows anything about AI being involved in here. It's just that those profiles were written really well, which is why people also in other conditions thought they were written by AI. So they're good, they're well written, in the end, more trustworthy even. As soon as we tell them that there's AI involved, they take a hit. In the labeled condition, that difference isn't significant. But as soon as there's some ambiguity about whether this was written by a human or is written by AI, we now have uncertainty. And as soon as there's uncertainty, take a really big hit. And even bigger hit when we got them to really think, was this written by a machine or was this written by a human? So as long as they're clearly labeled and we know who's doing what and when the machine's involved, trust doesn't get impacted. As soon as it's unclear, it takes a big hit on trust. And so we call that the replicant effect. So some of you may remember from one of my favorite movies, Blade Runner, Harrison Ford's character here has to try and figure out which is the human and which is the AI, because these AIs were very human-like, and it was very upsetting for all the humans to have realistic machines posing as humans. All right, so this is a first sort of like foray into the studies we're doing. I want to just show you some of the other areas we're working on that we think are important. Interpersonal dynamics. What happens, like this trust finding, when you see AI involved or AI gets involved? We've been doing several studies with our colleagues at Cornell that show when one person is sort of forced to use the smart replies when doing tasks with the other person, there's very little effect on task performance or anything like that. But the people that are talking to you think you're less socially attractive. So I think they're picking up on like, oh, you're kind of weird and like a little bit overly positive. They can't tell that you're using AI, but they just don't want to hang out with you as much afterwards. So I think we're going to see a lot of these kinds of implications. Another one is linguistics. So what happens when computers write in a lot of human language? Now with Google, we don't know, but there's probably tens of millions of these messages written a day, anything at Google scale. What happens when Google is introducing a positivity bias into our language? What happens if they're using smart responses that were trained up pre-pandemic? And so instead of saying, I hope you're well and safe, they're saying, hey, have a great day, or something like that. What happens when we introduce these kind of like unexamined biases or language phenomena into society at large? Are we going to have more positive language? And the last is, so there's an example. The last is there's really fascinating cultural and ethical questions. And I'll just finish with one. I'd mentioned to you before that you can train AI to write more trustworthy language. Well, what if you are a young Black woman and you're applying for a job? You face two biases. One, that you're underrepresented minority, and the second is that you're female. So you're just less likely to get a job because of these demographic factors. And let's say you use some AI to help you communicate with the person who's considering hiring you. And you use that AI to come across as trustworthy. What does trustworthy discourse sound like right now in our current Western society? Older white male discourse. And it doesn't matter right now what color you are or age, older white male discourse tends to be perceived as more trustworthy. So this young woman is overcoming double bias and reaping a significant benefit to herself, but at a pretty serious cost. It's homogenizing language, it's prioritizing another group's form of discourse. So I don't think that any of these questions are super straightforward, and have a lot of potentially fascinating questions around deception, around emotions, around the Cyrano de Bergerac effect of using AI to write and coming across as smarter and more sexy. And so I hope this has intrigued you, and that you kind of see the possibilities here and find it as interesting as I did. Thank you all for your attention. And these are my fantastic collaborators.
Thank you, Samir. I assume you're going to continue with the hosting here, but off to a good start. And I've got plenty of questions. I'm looking on the chat for questions and comments.
Yeah, maybe Mike, why don't you take one question while I pull up Julie's video?
Okay, so Juliana Schroeder, we could call on her actually. She's got a question up, and so does Josh Weiss. But Juliana, can you hop in?
Yes, sure. So my question might be context dependent, and it might be changing over time as well. But you kept talking about the role of introducing like positivity into language, which I think is really fascinating. But I'm wondering, like, to what extent are some of these AI conversation tools picking up on the positivity that was already there? So they're essentially just mimicking human communication as it already exists, versus like they're actually trying to change communication, which feels like so qualitatively different and introduces a whole new set of questions.
Right. It's a great question. And so I know somebody that works on the team there at Google now, and we're working on collaboration. The pandemic sort of shut that down for now. But I did interview somebody that worked on the initial program when it was getting spun up. And I'll just tell you a funny story. They were sort of modeling it on increasing the likelihood that you'd get a response, right? So that's this basic idea of the smart replies. And so they couldn't get the machine to stop suggesting "I love you!" exclamation mark. And so, like, no matter what, it would keep on saying this. And I think it's really hilarious, and isn't that beautiful that the machine was loving everybody so much? But it has interesting implication. In fact, they had to whitelist it. So basically, it would recommend "I love you!" exclamation mark, and then they just pulled it and made it recommend another thing. If you and I were emailing Juliana and I accidentally hit that, right, by accident, we'd have an issue, right? So now I'm saying something, but it would be.
I was just assuming you love me, but.
Well, I do. It's true. It wouldn't be that big of an issue, right? Yeah. But let's say it was one of my undergrad students and I accidentally hit that. Now we have actually like a legal HR type issue. So, right, they're working on it. I've also been very surprised that it is not.
Yeah. I would also just say that the grand majority of my email interactions, I do not want the person to respond. I'm like trying to shut down a student or something.
Yeah, right.
Just seeing that that's what they were optimizing on.
Right. And that's the thing is once we're going to be able to ask for different optimizations, I think it's going to open up the whole. I mean, the next question here from Josh was about negotiation. Well, as soon as we can have our own bespoke AIMC, you know, I'm literally working on right now about deception, right? And can you have your AI help you do deception better? Can it be used to detect it at all? So I think once optimization moves into this sort of a customized bespoke thing, like for sales, as an example, the person with the best AI is going to win because they're going to communicate better. So I think it's fascinating. I've also been shocked at how little personalization there is right now. So they don't personalize based on Jeff versus Juliana. It's just like based on our billions of messages, here's the most likely 3 things.
The other aspect I would say to Josh's question is you used the word trust a number of times, you know, in the Airbnb example and in the adjoining room where Mike Luca is speaking. He has done work on Airbnb. Do you know his work, Jeff? Or
Yes.
So it can be the language or it can be the picture. And inadvertently you get discrimination.
That's right, exactly. And so if you downsize the image to reduce the racism from the photo, but it's still occurring in the text, people can pick up on those signals. And, you know, I think that that's a really good point. And I think that Sheila's also asking about like the trustworthiness in context. It's true, like I come across, because I'm an older white male, is very trustworthy in this context. There are some others where I won't sound like a trustworthy person. So it is context dependent, but typically in sort of negotiation, job, academic, these kind of things, there is a more typically trustworthy sound. So that's another big issue we have to work on.
Great. Jeff, do you want to just take that last question from Ron, and then we'll switch gears to Julie's presentation? So what happens when people are labeled as untrustworthy? How easy or hard?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question because we make this decision about people really fast. So one of the 2 main dimensions we judge people within a couple hundred milliseconds is, do they seem competent and do they seem warm, which is really similar to this trustworthy, honest sort of space. It's complicated basically because initial like impressions really matter, and people that have this untrustworthy sort of impression that they give off, or if there's been a case where that happens, it's really hard to recover from in the short term. But reliability turns out to be this really important thing. So if I don't really trust you, but I give you that shot and you perform, you're competent, you do it when you're supposed to do it, reliability will trump any of those initial impressions. Problem is, you might not get that chance. So thanks for the question.
Terrific. Thank you, Jeff. So let's switch gears and turn to Julie's presentation. And just by way of background, Julie has a really interesting background for someone at a negotiations conference, which is that she is a roboticist and an aerospace engineer. So you might be wondering how her work fits in. I see some really powerful connections. A lot of what she works on is industrial robots. And if you think about industrial robots, they've historically been like confined to one part of a factory, and human workers work in separate areas. And the way that the boundaries have been established is that once a human enters the space of the industrial robot, the robot basically shuts down, right? And so it stops what it's doing to make sure there's no injury. But that's a really inefficient way of working because there are reasons for people to need to move around the factory floor all the time. And so the kind of negotiation that Julie thinks about is the negotiation between a robot and a human that are having to like share the same space, and how they coordinate and navigate that physical space together. So I'm going to show you about a 5-minute clip from one of her recent talks on this topic, where she shares some experiments she's run, and there are a couple of video clips that'll bring to life what I'm talking about.
Okay, what I'd like to do in the few minutes I have remaining before I open up to questions is just touch on some of the challenges of learning team fluency through experience and practice. As I mentioned, much of manual work, wherever we see manual work, we see individualized styles for performing that work. And that poses challenges for tasking a robot to assist a person side by side. Because if we program a robot to work with one person, that doesn't necessarily mean that robot will work effectively with another person. And so what we want to do is be able to develop individualized models for how a robot can develop, for example, a statistical model of human behavior, and then use that in its own task plan to figure out what actions to take and what order to take those actions in, and then how to schedule them. The safety standards for human-robot collaboration with industrial robots look something like this. So this is an implementation in our lab. They require that the robot slow and stop as a person nears the robot. So you can see as a person comes into space, the robot slows and stops before it makes contact. One of the challenges with these safety standards is that this robot is performing a pre-sequenced set of actions, and if the person happens to be in that space, that robot will just stop for a long while, right? And it's not taking into account knowledge of where that person will be next. So while we want to maintain the safety standards, what we want to do is be able to add a little bit of anticipation in this robot, a little bit of understanding of where that person will be, so as to improve the efficiency of this interaction. That's the goal. And the way we approach this is to try to take insight from how human teams learn to work together effectively over time. So a standard, gold standard technique in human team training is something called cross-training. That's where people physically switch roles and take someone else's job for some period of time. They do this in the factory, aviation crews do this, military tactical teams do this. There's a practical benefit, for example, in the factory. If someone is out sick, someone else knows how to do their job. But there's another benefit, which is empirically developed in the literature, which is that it enhances development of shared mental models. So something about actually taking someone else's job allows you not to only learn how to do your job, but to learn how your partner, what they need to do their job effectively. And you bring that knowledge back with you to then do your job, not only better for yourself, but better for your teammates. And enhanced shared mental models, training through cross-training, also shows a benefit in off-nominal circumstances when things don't go according to plan. So what we noticed, or what we thought, was that many of the techniques we use to train robots is really focused on one-way transfer of information from the person to the robot. That does not look like human team training techniques. So for example, training a robot through interactive reward. When it does something, you say good, the robot does something, you say bad, and it learns over time. That's transferring one way from the person to the robot. That is actually documented as among the most inefficient techniques to train a team of people to work together. So we just thought as a hypothesis, what if we were to take a standard interactive reinforcement learning algorithm and modify it to take its inputs through cross-training with the person, same inputs, but through a different mechanism. Not only do we support the robot's learning, but we now also support the human's learning of how to work with the robot. And maybe that leads to better team performance. And in our experiments, we do have a number of exciting statistically significant results. So what our hypothesis is that we can improve human-robot teams. We can improve their execution if they receive their training through cross-training rather than through, for example, in this case, we use Sarsa Lambda as our benchmark. So we designed a computational framework for robot learning through cross-training, and then we compared it to Sarsa Lambda. What we did was conduct large-scale human subject experiments. We had 36 people come into the lab and train to work with the robot in a graphical user interface environment. So we had half the people come in and train in cross-training, half the people come in and train through interactive reward. In cross-training, people and robot would physically switch roles. In interactive reward, the robot would do something and the person would assign a reward. What we then did was for the first time, we had the person go and work with the real robot. And we measured objective measures of team fluency, as well as the robot's uncertainty on actions of the human teammate, and then subjective measures of team performance as well. And we did those subjective measures through a post-experiment questionnaire. So I'm going to show you 2 quick clips before I show you the results, so you can see the quality and the difference of the teamwork. The task here was a place and drill task. So the person placed 3 screws and the robot drilled them in. The person could train the robot to work with them any way they wanted. The smart people knew that this is a real industrial robot and it's very dangerous, and trained the robot to stay out of their way until they had placed all screws, and then the robot would come in and drill them. Other people were more efficiency motivated, and they aimed to train the robot to drill screws as soon as they were placed. So this is a video clip of a person working with the robot after they trained through interactive reward assignment. And what you can kind of see is the person places the screw and then kind of hesitates, looks to see what the robot's going to do. They don't really seem sure what the robot's going to do. And when the robot starts moving, they pull their hand out of the space. When the robot stops moving, they come back into the space. I can show you that again. I think it'll play fully the second time. So qualitatively, it seems as if the person is unsure of what the robot will do. Okay, so this is a task execution after cross-training, and this looks pretty different. So in this case, the person places the first screw, goes to place the second screw, and stays in the space as the robot starts moving. And they finish the task. These are representative samples from the videos. What we saw was that human idle time decreased by 41% after cross-training, and concurrent motion increased by 71%. Both of these were statistically significant results. So what you see with your eyes does match up here. We used an MDP model as the computational model for training. And so what we can measure is the entropy rate within the MDP. And this corresponds to the robot's uncertainty in what the human will do next. And that's because we modeled the human as the stochasticity in the environment. And what we can see is after the 3 rounds of training, after cross-training, the robot is statistically significantly more sure what the robot will do than after interactive reward assignment. Now, why this is another question. This could be because of adaptation on the person's side. It could be because of better learning on the robot side. The inputs are the same, but what the inputs mean is different. It's not clear what someone means when they're assigning reward, whereas when you learn by switching roles, that's potentially more informative in this context. For the subjective measures, we saw a number of statistically significant subjective measures, and the subjective measures are very interesting to me because they're typically the most important for adoptance of the technology. And we saw statistically significant differences in people agreeing that they trusted the robot. They agreed more strongly they trusted the robot after cross-training than through the benchmark. And they agreed more strongly that the robot performed according to their preference.
Let me pause there. And Julie, of course, is not here right now, but I'm wondering if that video provoked any thoughts or points of connection you saw with what Jeff presented. And feel free to either put it into the chat or just to speak up.
So sometimes, Samir, often I ask people for a metaphor for negotiation. And I get things all across the board. Some people are cheerful about it, some are scared. In both categories, I hear references to dance. So it's like a waltz. Negotiation is like a waltz. I have had another one, it's like a scorpion's mating dance. So very different significance, but dance in both instances of how the parties are engaging each other, whether hostilely or in a more loving kind of way. And when I was watching the arm of the robot get out of the way and the dance going on in the hands, I'm wondering what we could provide, maybe not mechanically, but in some sort of way where we could teach each other the dance of negotiation. I'm speaking metaphorically, but that's what came to me first.
That's interesting. Maybe 1 or 2 other thoughts?
I thought it was very interesting that, we often think about kind of machine learning from humans, and this flipping that to, sort of humans needing to learn in a sense, if not from machines, at least how the operating interaction or the dance that Mike is talking about. I'm wondering about how much the assumptions and prior experiences people have really distort that experience. So if you've had some personal, it could be either direction experience, I could imagine that your starting point is radically different. And similarly, I'm wondering if you've gone through and had as you're learning from the very beginning, those early moments, I suspect, are important because you probably link right back into your assumptive patterns. But I'd welcome reactions on any of that.
Anyone have thoughts on that? Or Sheila, I think you were about to say something as well.
Yeah, I had a question that kind of went in a different direction. If anybody has a comment on Ron's point, which I liked.
What we can also do is share the chat questions with Julie, and she might be able to weigh in with her thoughts on this afterwards. Go ahead.
The thing that I was going to comment on, it's a little bit related, Ron, to what you were saying, is the question of, do they trust the robot? Here feels like a slightly different use of the word trust than what we were talking about earlier about like trustworthy language.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's overlap, but here it feels to me like the do I trust the robot has to do with, do I feel the robot is predictable, is going to do what I expect the robot to do consistently so that I know how to be safe and interact with it, and it's paying attention to my preferences. But it has a lot to do with predictability. Mm-hmm. And when we talk about Airbnb hosts and we talk about, do they seem trustworthy? Part of it's about predictability, but part of it has to do with, do I think they have my interests in mind? Do I think they're going to operate in good faith? And that part of trust, I assume, is removed. Although maybe if you're negotiating with an agent, an AI agent, you don't think that they have your best interest in mind at all.
Yeah, Jeff, wondering if you could comment on that, and then maybe I'll use that as a segue to turn to my presentation after Jeff comments.
Sure, yes. Really great point. I think it reminds me, I didn't define trust, but I really like Lerman's definition, which is confidence in your expectations. And I think it gets at both of the things you were saying there. In one case, it's like, is this person going to murder me when I go stay at their house? In another case, is this robot going to be competent, do what I expect it to do? The other point you raised is a good one. We've been thinking about this framework from economics called the principal agent framework, where we are modeling the AI as a kind of agent in this sort of economic framework. And then all these other asymmetries come in, and like moral hazard and conflict of interest, especially since there's the AI, and it should be working for you, but then it's owned by, let's say, Google or Airbnb. So it's a really rich theoretical sort of space, and trust is like embedded in all of it, or trustworthiness.
Perfect, thanks, Jeff. So let me turn to my presentation, which is about this idea of diversity, or cognitive diversity. And obviously there's a very large literature on cognitive diversity and team performance. And what I want to talk about is a language-based measure of cognitive diversity, which we call discursive diversity. So just as by way of kind of motivation, there's obviously, as I mentioned, a very large literature on cognitive diversity. It's invoked in the explanations about why some groups are more successful than others, including when they are negotiating with one another or negotiating with other groups. And the literature has reached conflicting opinions about the conditions under which diversity is helpful or harmful to the performance of a team. And here I'm thinking about cognitive diversity in particular. And if we kind of were to try to distill it down, a lot of the literature really describes this diversity performance trade-off, which is that teams that are cognitively diverse, on one hand, are able to traverse a wider search space. They're better able to harness collective insights, recombine ideas, and that can spur creativity and innovation. But on the flip side, this cognitive diversity makes it harder to coordinate, can erode cohesion within the group and lead to conflict. And so you can also get misalignment. And so the idea is that teams can be either good at creative ideation or at coordinated execution, but typically not at both simultaneously. But if we think about the assumptions embedded in a lot of the literature on group cognitive diversity, the assumption is that group cognition is relatively stable, at least over the lifespan of a team. That the ways in which people think and their personalities and their styles are relatively fixed traits. And so what matters is the composition of those traits in a given team, and that's going to influence the performance of the team. And what we want to do in this project is to shift away from this more static conception of group cognition to a more dynamic one that also thinks about the group cognition arising through interaction amongst people. So if we, again, dig a bit more deeply into how teams operate, we see that people's assumptions, individual members' assumptions about the nature of the problem that the group is trying to solve, the solutions that might exist, can change through interaction, and the ways in which they interact with each other can either amplify or dampen those differences. And so it's often very difficult to simply categorize a group as being diverse or homogeneous. And the kind of premise in this paper is that group shared cognition can fluctuate, even on a daily basis, between convergence and divergence at different points in time, and that these temporal shifts can have implications for the performance of the group. So we're not the first people to think about the role of time in group processes. There are prior studies that have looked at this. And a lot of that work, for example, looking at teams oscillating between periods of intense face-to-face work and solo work, or the idea that when teams exchange information intermittently rather than constantly or not at all, that allows people to kind of modulate between these two modes of ideation and coordination. But these are really focused more on the structure and sequence of interactions and have not considered the possibility that group cognition can itself change over time. And so the idea in this project is to introduce a new construct to this literature, which we call discursive diversity. Just to get some definitions out, by group cognition, we mean the set of cognitive representations of a problem and its potential solutions, as well as how those representations are distributed amongst group members. And we could think about group cognitive diversity as the extent to which those representations are aligned or misaligned amongst people. The key point we want to build on, though, is this third one, which is that in many cases, a person's cognitive representation of a problem or solution will be privately held, but never actually expressed, right? So there's often a mismatch between what someone is thinking and what they're saying. And that can happen because there may be contexts in which people don't feel comfortable to voice those disagreements, or they may hold back in stating them if, for example, they're facing an impending deadline, and bringing up a different way of thinking about the problem might throw the group off track. So the construct we're going to focus on is what we call discursive diversity, or the level of convergence or divergence in meanings that are expressed at a given point in time. And what we're going to argue is that groups can escape this diversity performance trade-off by modulating the level of discursive diversity they have to their task environment. And we're going to think about two broad kinds of tasks: more ideational tasks and more coordination-based tasks. And the simple hypothesis is that this measure of group cognitive diversity, discursive diversity, will increase the likelihood of success when groups are engaged in ideational tasks, but instead get in the way and be harmful when groups are engaged in coordination tasks. Okay, so part of the reason we propose that the literature has come to this more static conception of group cognition is that the kind of workhorse in this literature, the methodological workhorse, has been self-reports. And self-reports are obviously very useful. Interviews can be very useful to understand different facets of group cognition, but it's difficult to administer them more than just episodically. And so maybe beginning, middle, and end of a team, for example. They're usually ill-suited to measuring fine-grained temporal variation, and they tend to focus on a person's deliberative mental models, whereas meaning is often produced through more automatic forms of cognition. So we're instead going to use language as a window into group cognitive diversity. And we could think about language as a kind of a form of behavior that also reflects underlying categories of thought and shared conventions, and that enable people to coordinate with each other. In prior work, colleagues of mine and I have done some work looking at language as a window into organizational culture, and we have a series of projects related to that. Here we're going to think about language as a window into cognitive diversity. And there has been work looking at language and group cognition. It's tended to focus on a particular label or category, like a frame about how the work should get done that gets imposed on the setting by the researcher. We're going to instead use a method that's going to allow us to uncover these categories and the semantic meaning from the text itself. And the approach we're going to use is now one that is pretty widely used in the world of natural language processing. It's a word embedding model. And I won't go through the details of the mechanics of the model, but I'll explain the intuition of it, which is just as in social networks research, you can tell something about an individual based on the company he or she keeps. The idea here is that you can infer the meanings of a word by the local context in which it's embedded. And Word2Vec, which is the application we use, is a simple two-layer neural network that's going to learn the vector representation of every word in our corpus in a many-dimensional space. And the idea with this many-dimensional space is that the individual dimensions are not interpretable, but distances in this space are. And the semantic relationships amongst words are going to be preserved in vector operations. So in one of the canonical papers on this, if you apply this model to a large corpus and you find the vector for the word Berlin and subtract the vector for Germany and add the vector for France, the model will point you to the vector for Paris. In other words, it's uncovering these relationships amongst the words. Okay, and we're going to apply this now to an online platform called Gigster that brings together virtual teams of software developers to work on projects for clients. This is comparable to Upwork, which some of you may know, which is a freelance platform, a platform that brings together freelancers with people who need their services. The difference here is that the work on this platform is much more complex, much longer term, much more interdependent, and can't be performed by just an individual freelancer. Instead, there are teams of freelancers that are coming together, working together for an average of almost 160 days. We have data from 117 of these teams representing 421 unique individuals. You see the kind of demographic breakdown there. And for the most part, many of these people have never worked together. They're not physically co-located. They're kind of spread out around the world. And because of that, they're communicating almost exclusively via Slack, on the communications platform that is now pretty common in many workplaces. We have about 800,000 Slack messages that are sent on the public channels. We don't have access to direct messages or private channels. To the best of our knowledge, this represents the bulk of the communications that happen. Since these people don't have close relationships with one another, they tend to use mostly public channels to communicate, but that is a limitation in the data. Okay, and because this is a software development platform, the way in which these teams work is fairly standardized. They operate using the so-called Scrum framework or Agile development, wherein the project is broken down into a series of milestones, each of which entails a so-called sprint. And what the feature of this that we're going to take advantage of is the fact that these milestones have predictable phases of activity within them. They start with a coordination phase, which is about setting the goals and clarifying who's going to do what. Then there's a middle part, which is the daily Scrum work, which is much more about ideation and problem solving. And then finally, there's a coordination phase again, where they are going to review the work they've done and plan for the next phase. So in our dependent variable in the analysis I'm about to show you is whether or not a team achieved a given milestone. And this is an important outcome in this setting because unlike things like customer satisfaction scores, which don't vary so much across teams, this dependent variable does vary quite a bit. Some teams hit certain milestones, others don't. And when they miss, there are serious economic consequences for that team and for Gigster. So at least in our interviews and conversations with the folks at Gigster, they view this as one of the most important indicators of team performance. And it's not just about timeliness, it's also about quality, because clients have to sign off on every milestone before it's considered to be complete. Okay, so what we're going to do is take the 800,000 Slack messages, we're going to apply this word embedding model. And this is a kind of standard way that one checks to see whether a word embedding model is recovering the kind of meaning relationships that might exist within the text. And you see that, for example, it has learned, our model, that bug in this setting, in the context of software development, is not about insects, but is related to issues. So bug minus code points you to an issue. Milestone plus a deliverable is a sprint. Man plus casual in this setting is a dude. Instagram minus photos is Facebook. California minus startup is Australia, and so on. Okay, so our measure of discursive diversity, we're going to first take the embedding centroid for every person in every day as a first point. So if we find the centroid for all of their posts in a given day to Slack, then we're going to compute the cosine distance between the embedding centroids for every dyad on the team. And then we're going to basically just take the average pairwise distance across all dyads. And that's our definition of discursive diversity. One important thing to note is that contrary to the assumptions that I think are in a lot of the literature about the stability of group cognition, here we see that this is 20 randomly selected teams. On the left-hand side, we've got them across the life stage of the team, where 0.5 corresponds to the half-life of the team. And on the right-hand side, we're looking within milestones. And again, 0.5 is the half-life of the milestone. There's tremendous fluctuation in this measure over the course of time. It's, the blue line represents the mean, but it belies all of the variation we see across teams and over time. Okay, so this is the kind of summary of the main results. So these are linear probability models of milestone completion on discursive diversity. We include a control for topical diversity, by which we mean the set of topics being discussed. So this is like, how semantically diverse is the team given a level of topical diversity. We also have team fixed effects. So these are within team models, milestone length fixed effects, to account for the fact that some longer milestones might be more complicated, might be harder to hit, for example, and milestone number fixed effects, given that early milestones might be easier or harder to hit than later milestones. So we're accounting for that variation. And consistent with the expectation, we see this negative relationship between discursive diversity and the likelihood of hitting a milestone in a timely fashion during stage 1 and stage 3, which are the coordination stages. And we see this positive relationship in the middle stage, which is more about ideation. So just to quickly summarize, I hope this talk has helped to convince you that interactional language use can reveal some important facets of cognitive diversity in teams, and that group cognition is not as static as I think the literature has assumed, but shifts as members interact with each other. We've introduced a new form of group cognitive diversity, which we call discursive diversity, and we argue that groups can overcome the performance trade-off of diversity by matching this level of discursive diversity to their task environments. We show some evidence that's consistent with that, recognizing that we don't have a controlled experiment here. So this is, even with the statistical controls, not yet a causal estimate that's fully pinned down. And finally, I think an open question, an interesting question we want to turn to next is, how can groups and leaders within groups actually manage the levels of discursive diversity to try to match them to the needs of the team. So with that, I will stop and take any questions people might have.
Can I throw in a question? I knew that I was going to do this, Samir. Not the first time I've questioned you, Samir, right? I mean, I forget where you sat in class, but that was
Mike was my negotiations professor when I was at HBS for my MBA. So
and you survived it.
Yes.
I'm as cranky now as I was then, probably more so. I'm interested in all the decision-making research. and hats off to Kahneman and Tversky and so forth. But my problem with it is it always defines what the decision is. You're given a choice, you have options, and there are consequences, maybe probabilistic, maybe fixed, but you're given a particular decision. I think the interesting part of it is how you apprehend the world that you're operating in and why certain things are salient to you and why we have blind spots and all that sort of thing. What you're making me, maybe us, think about is, okay, go from the individual who has to formulate things to a group. And on one hand, it seems to me you'd think at first blush we want to be seeing the same world, you know, but not necessarily. And I know a little bit about the John F. Kennedy history, and he was suckered into the Bay of Pigs. He learned something from it, and he deliberately chose a group of contending points of view, representing those points of view, when it came to the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's much more complicated than that. But if you have a way of populating a group so that you know that there are people there not only have different preferences, but different abilities, tendencies to perceive a situation, come up with a diagnosis, there's a point where you want to expand the possibilities, and damn it, you got to make a decision. You kind of narrow down to it. I'm very interested in how you can, I mean, it's finally a point where we get prescriptive and so forth, but even identifying what's productive and what's not seems to me to be a huge step if we're thinking about formulating whether this is I see as a problem, you see it as an opportunity, you know, and that's central to negotiation, it strikes me.
I mean, my belief technically is that it's possible to think about constructing teams with an eye to dialing up or dialing down the level of discursive diversity that will get expressed, right? Just based on past communications that a person has had and simulating and forecasting how they would likely interact. Questions about how to implement that in ways that are ethical and that, you know, are not going to have unintended consequences, I think that's a really open question in my mind. There are increasingly now, as many of you know, a lot of startups that are providing dashboards of different kinds, these kind of linguistic measures to managers of how they're communicating with their teams. And I think it's easier in one sense to develop the measures than it is to figure out how to implement them in a managerially appropriate way.
Maybe others want to jump in here.
Let's take maybe one or two more questions or comments, and then want to make sure we have time for Diyi's presentation as well.
Samir, I had just a quick clarification question. Discursive diversity, I heard it for the first time. If you could expand that a bit more about what it really means in other contexts as well. So
which term?
Discursive diversity.
Yeah, so I mean, I think of it as sort of semantic diversity, right? It's the diversity in meanings that people are expressing when discussing a given set of topics. So on a software development team, we might be talking about user interface, that's a topic. But the ways in which we're understanding the customer needs might be quite divergent. And in that divergence, we might be able to be more generative in terms of our ideas. Conversely, it might also impede our ability to coordinate. That's sort of the sense in which I'm thinking about it. Okay, so with that, Diyi, do you want to go next?
Try to share my screen. Let's see. Okay, can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Hello, everyone. I am Diyi Yang. I'm an assistant professor at Georgia Tech. First, I want to say that this is my first time presenting my work to a negotiation expert. So I do most computational work. So we develop algorithms to do smart reply, like Jeff mentioned. We also do personalized text generation models so that it takes into your writing histories and generate Jeff-like kind of replies. So maybe it's very negative, maybe it's very neutral. So we do a lot of algorithms algorithm design. So today I want to offer a very different perspective where some of our computational work touch on the concept of persuasion and negotiation. So I personally view this as a chance to get feedback and then share what's happening on the AI side. Okay, so we all talk about negotiation, persuasion. So this is the joint process of decision making, and it has a lot to do with language, especially those days. So recently there is increasing focus on the design of automatic negotiation bot or chatbot to kind of automatically and also independently engage or negotiate with others. So as you can see the news articles here, like deal or not on no deal, training AI bots to negotiate, like a lot of work those days. I would say that some of them still have a lot to do with what Jeff mentioned about AI mediated communication, a lot of factors to take into account here. And again, I think it's still a little bit far away from us. So understanding the basic steps here involved towards building those negotiation chatbot is necessary and a starting point. So my work actually looks at how humans use language to persuade, to negotiate in different contexts. So here I took approach from both the theories in psychology and the computational linguistics to study this phenomenon and also build some algorithms. Here we mainly look at some of the domains like crowdfunding, peer-to-peer learning platform, where we have language data and some kind of mirrors of the persuasion. And I will use the next 10 minutes to give you some findings that we have. Again, I'm not going to do a deep dive of each of them because the work itself is mainly algorithm design, but I want to take some of the general findings that we did. So I'll first talk about how we detect persuasive language strategies that people use at a sentence level. And then we look at some unwanted framing in language and to see how AI could remove such bias in our language. And lastly, I want to share some of the thoughts on how or what are the difficulties and the challenges we encounter when we build AI models for persuasion or negotiation. Okay, so the first part. Here, we mainly look at the crowdfunding website called Kiva, which is a peer-to-peer learning platform. And we want to study what makes those advocacy messages persuasive. So for example, here is one advocacy message. So the user wrote that I'm the first lender on this woman-led group loan in Burma. This loan will be utilized to repair her old duck farm and enable her to purchase nutritious duck feed that can help boost duck egg production. This way, she will be able to support her children's education in the future. So based on the system log, we know that after people read this message, some of them, 3 out of 50 people choose to lend. So here we want to figure out what persuasion strategies have been used in each sentence and estimate how persuasive this message is going to be even before it was sent out. And ideally, we want to help advocates to write those persuasive message in a more effective way. So we took advantage of this line of due processing theory from psychology side to obtain a set of persuasion strategies that people widely use in their request. So to give you a quick overview of the theory, so the heuristic processing occurs when we don't think deeply about a message and we are persuaded by superficial cues in the language or the situation. On the other side, so the systematic processing happens when we think deeply about a message and we are persuaded by the strength of the arguments. And it often requires the motivation, the ability to think deeply. So in this context, we kind of utilize this theory framework to design something that we can mirror or we can find in language. So basically, we translate those theories into a set of what we call discourse acts or conversational acts here. So we identify some of them that people use widely, such as scarcity, like the loan is going to expire in 30 minutes, please help, or like buy it, only 2 left. We also have emotion, like people describe their message in a very miserable way or in a very positive way. We have identity, that is people like their group or identity more over others. So you can imagine that they share their like home country or where they do their undergraduate school to get more liking. And commitment, concreteness, and impact. So the last 2 actually belong to what we call the systematic processing. Okay, so this is like the theory leveraging side. The goal that our work did is to automatically predict the persuasive strategies at each sentence level, because that's the operational level we can manage. And then we also want to predict the overall persuasiveness of request. So given this context, this message, this language, we want to know how many people it may persuade. I'm not going to go deep into the method here, but I want to mention that we designed a novel hierarchical neural network, and it has best performance compared to existing approach for predicting persuasion strategies. And then for the 6 classification here, we have a reasonable accuracy with 80% for some of them, and an overall of 60% accuracy. So now you can imagine that with those like neural network models, we can use it to predict the persuasion strategies in millions of messages on the website. So here, what we did is that we use the model, we apply the model trained on the data to predict persuasion strategies in any advocacy request in this domain. And then we kind of build linear regression models to predict the persuasiveness by looking at the specific strategies that people use. Evaluating on thousands of advocacy requests, we found that when people are mentioning their identity, such as they come from the same location or they come from a specific representative group, or if they expressing concrete details in the message, those actions actually help their request get fulfilled. But we also found that mentioning the limited amount of time of their loan does not work well for this context. So part of the reason is that maybe if it's only 10 minutes, not many people are going to see the request or take actions. We also had different results, not different results. We also applied the model to different contexts, and we found that it's not like every persuasion strategy works similarly for every context. It's more about like how you use it for a proper context. Okay, so those are the language cues that people use. But like persuasion not only comes from the language itself, it could also come from the surrounding context here. So as we can see, if you look at the context here, in addition to the language we just studied, there are also informations about the advocator and also about the borrower themselves. And when you click that link, you can see the borrower picture, the loan description, location, loan amount, blurb, all sorts of things here. We further kind of look at some of the computer vision techniques to look at the picture here. Specifically, we look at some of the demographic attributes from the profile pictures, such as their age, how many people are in the picture, whether they have some like expressions on their face, and also gender, etc. So here are some of the high-level takeaways we have. So we found that lenders are 3% less likely to make loans to female borrowers, and they are 3.5% more likely to lend to borrowers who smiled on their profile picture. So this kind of confirms some of the prior research on effective use of persuasion language. And we also found that when people first join the community, they are very likely to lend, but like over time, they kind of become more strategically like investing in loans, and like 67% less likely to lend. So that's some work we did here. As I mentioned, we also applied to some of the social domain where on Reddit, there's a very interesting subreddit called Random Acts of Pizza. So basically you write a request to convince others to give you free pizza. We also did our study there and have very interesting results. I strongly recommend you to check out the paper to see some of the interesting messages. So far I kind of shared what makes language persuasive and how we detect them. But like, what if there are some kind of unwanted framing in our language? How could we get rid of them? Okay, so before that, I want to give a quick background here. So based on a recent web survey, overall US adults estimate that 62% of the news they read in newspapers, see on television, or hear on the radio is biased. And it's even more, much higher, 80% of the news they see on social media. So when we look at the different type of news article headlines, like what we have here on the screen, so two of them, one seems a little bit more neutral compared to others. So I'm going to read it. The first one is John McCain exposed as an agent of the Rothschild. And then the second news article is, it refers to the same event. John McCain accused of accepting inappropriate donation from the Rothschild. So the second one used the words of accused of, while the first one used exposed. So it has some of the implications, framings that may modify our believability of the statement. So we kind of want to do this type of thing, like kind of suggest less biased alternative to text. So think of if you are writing a statement and you are not sure whether this is going to be biased or kind of not factual or whatever. So can the technology help here? Okay, so we kind of like study all sorts of framing bias that people use in language and then categorize them into three categories. So framing bias, epistemological bias, and also demographic bias. So you can see some of the example messages here. Like the first one, most of the gameplay is pilfered from versus developing a new downtown will bring back our arts, or a lead programmer usually spends his career. So as a technology developer, we want to make sure that if we detect anything that could be subjectively biased, we could suggest alternatives for people. So here, instead of pilfered from, we could choose based on versus we'll bring it back. Like sounds very authoritative. Actually, it means which is promoters hope will bring back our arts. And especially like a demographic bias, his career versus their career. So we want to remove this kind of presupposition of gender or other protected attributes of language. Again, the contribution of our work was to introduce a deep learning-based approach to de-biased text. So basically the input will be a biased statement, and then the output is going to be a relative neutral one. So you can view it as a black box. I just want to mention that we have state-of-art performance for this task, and it's actually working very well. We also ask human annotators to judge whether the output text from the algorithm decrease the bias or not, and we found that the model provides very good interpretability of the method itself. We trained the model on Wikipedia. So basically when editors edit an article, especially change from bias to neutral. So that's where we train our model to learn how humans perform this task. So Wikipedia has a huge amount of data. So that's why we can do a good job here. Interestingly, we also apply our model to a lot of real world scenarios, not a lot of them. We tried 3 domains here. We look at the news headlines from some of the news articles. We look at the president debate speech. We also look at the political books. So as you can see here, the original is some of the sample sentence from different domain. That's before, that's the input to our model. And then the output here is what I see our method here after. So activists have filed a lawsuit versus critics of it. Zuckerberg claims Facebook can versus Zuckerberg stated Facebook can or size Facebook can. Or this includes amazing Americans like. So you can see some of the interesting modifications the model is producing here. So building on this method, we are also trying to develop an intervention where whenever people are writing their message on a platform, we can suggest, let's say, less toxic wording for them, like more persuasive wording for them, and then less biased wording for them. So it's actually working very well with the recent advances in natural language processing. Okay, so that's the how to remove some of the unwanted framing. So in the last 1 minute or two, I want to focus on some of the opportunities and the challenge that we have. First, there are a lot of recent work those days about how to build a negotiation conversational agents. So think about this is one actually human conversation, but we really want to replace the seller here with a chatbot. So the buyer will say, hi, how old are the end tables? Then the chatbot will take advantage of all the available information that's available to it, and then kind of have these natural conversations with real human. So in addition to kind of negotiate a price, so researchers those days in the computational field also used or built a chatbot to play negotiation type of games with each other in a natural language way. So, so the first game here is Catan, so where you can kind of negotiate a different type of goods with others. And it's working very well for those well-defined scenario. So taking all of those into consideration, so here are a list of what I think could better help understand the persuasion in general from a computational perspective. So we have demonstrated how to kind of predict the persuasiveness of text requests at scale. So we can do this at a very large scale, millions of messages. We also want to kind of model persuasion in a multimodal way. So not only the image, text, audio, a lot of things could matter here. Because you can do it in an automatic way for a lot of contexts, we could understand what persuasion tactic works better for a specific audience. So thinking about the logos, pathos, and ethos framework proposed by Aristotle. We can also suggest effective and personalized wording and framing to people if they want to kind of utilize technology for this purpose, and also kind of engage in negotiation conversations like human, conversational agents to kind of accomplish different type of tasks. So those are all the kind of problems that could be introduced into the computational field. On the other side, there are different type of challenges right now that I think deserve more attention while building those computational approach. So for first type of thing is that we need a lot of data, and it's really hard to get a large scale data, especially a lot of the negotiation price related thing are kind of company private. So it's really hard to get such training data. And the second thing is that we need a collaboration, and we need a leverage and utilization of theories and domain knowledge in the field of persuasion, in the field of negotiation. We need better models to improve the performance, to kind of learn from those naturally human generated data. We also need transparent interpretable models so that we know what our models are learning. Privacy is a big issue here because it's a trade-off between personalization and privacy. On one side, we do not want to use your personalized information to give you price suggestion or give you different type of color of your clothes. But on the other side, we wanted to make it personalized so that you will like the deal much better. And again, there is also a lot to discuss for the ethical part. So whether it is okay to kind of generate a very persuasive message that we know is going to persuade you based on your prior history, and a lot of things we need to discuss here, whether we should use it. And also good faith persuasion versus some of the manipulation or whatever. So that's what I want to share about the work here.
Great, thank you, Diyi.
Thank you.
So several questions have come in on the chat. Ron, I want to start with Ron's question, if we could, which is he's drawing a connection between Diyi's and Jeff's talks, and specifically asking the extent to which the level of trust or trustworthiness might affect persuasiveness. So some of Diyi's categories, origins, words could be seen as different kinds of proxies for trust. Jeff or Diyi, do you want to comment on that question?
Diyi, why don't you go first?
Okay, yeah, so I think
That's not fair.
I think it's a great question and has a very nice combination of the two. So the kind of persuasion strategies I mentioned here are human generated. So we are never kind of experimenting with AI so far. So those kind of different techniques like the identity, mentioning about their location, and then the wording, emotion type of thing are from humans. So I think those type of strategies may be very subtle or trivial for, not trivial, like complicated for AI to perform. So for example, if an AI kind of generates a very emotional message, you won't be able to trust it. You don't think that the AI is having a miserable life. And then also like it's also unfair for the AI to kind of share some of the location or etc. So I think there is a lot of to discuss when we kind of also bring back to Samir's talk, like what's the role of the AI in this kind of collaboration? If you think it as a teamwork, what's the role of the AI here, right? So for it may facilitate the writing by providing some of the template messages, but the human should have the control to kind of decide whether to use it or not. So in that case, we can create some kind of trustable message versus if the AI kind of take 100% control of the message drafting process, then it sounds a little bit weird. And I want to say not persuasive.
I'll just follow up to say, you know, I completely agree. And I think the AI's autonomy is going to be a big question. So the degree to which it can operate on its own versus you have to, you know, like with Smart Reply, you have to choose each one. The AI can't communicate on your behalf. But I'll just say, Diyi, your work is amazing and makes me think even more about how AI is going to be able to play, you know, really rich roles in how language and communication gets modified. And it heightens both my excitement and concern.
So can I ask a follow-up question again to both Jeff and Diyi, as I was thinking about your talks, which is that as we think about like what makes something persuasive, for example, or trustworthy, part of it is that what we're seeing is something that's like distinctive or unique in some ways, right? So if we end up in a world where, you know, the forms of communication are becoming increasingly templatized via AI, is there like a kind of inadvertent adverse effect in the long run where we actually paradoxically become less persuasive because there's not as much differentiation?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, so this reminds me of one phenomenon. I just want to quickly share it. So those days when we look at the movies or music, we look at the content recommended to us by algorithms. So some of the theories are claiming that, oh, it's kind of creating a narrow and a narrower like a vision for us because we are used to this and it's kind of reducing the diversity. I think similar issues exist when we kind of create AI or ask AI to help us with persuasive wording or whatever. But I really like what Jeff mentioned in his talk that like the personalization matters here and also the audience matter here. So you cannot enumerate every possible person and like audience, right? So it's still going to be a dynamic process that the algorithm need to adapt to. So the possible combination of person, audience, and then context could be innumerous. So yeah, I kind of positive towards the future.
I'll follow up very briefly to say I like that last point. It's like hip hop, which can reuse old material and repurpose it and make, you know, entertainment and originality and art from old things. So you can continually have this sort of this re-up, I think.
Dee, another question on the chat that comes from Susan, which is, have you ever tried using the model in reverse? So say you were, a political campaign manager and you actually did want to dial up the emotive content. Have you tried running it in backwards?
Theoretically, yes. So I think as long as you have the parallel data or you have some kind of data, you can, of course, let's say you have a wording right now for, let's say, trying to persuade the people to donate to charity. And with the help of AI, we could make it more persuasive based on who might be the audience. So if the audience are going to be people in high tech, people who are male, people in their 20s, then the wording we are going to use may be specific or personalized to that group of people. And then we can also kind of operate based on all the factors we mentioned in the persuasion section, like maybe we want to highlight your identity, or maybe we want to kind of highlight some of the emotional. If we know that such tactics are working for this population, then it's kind of possible to modify the algorithm to kind of suggest potential wording. So one of the recent work we are doing is to build a model system which we call recast. So basically you give us a message, and then it may be biased, toxic, or whatever. And we are going to suggest a wording so that it won't change your semantic meaning, but then the resulting sentence is less toxic. It expresses the same meaning, but in a more polite and neutral, positive way. So we haven't tried, but it's possible.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in if I may. I'm mindful of the clock. I just put up the URL for the Mike Lucas session. And I'm sorry there wasn't an earlier announcement on this, but if people can take a few deep breaths, I think it'd be appropriate for us to have a wrap up here. But before we leave, and Lara, I don't know if you can communicate with somebody over in Mike's thing that we're about to drop in. Before we wrap up, I want to thank Samir for reuniting and for putting together, I think, a really nice way to this phase of our conversation to put this in a larger social context, frankly, more specifically than I thought we would do. And to be introduced to people like Jeff and Diyi, we're doing such interesting work. And I hope you'll pass along our thanks and best regards to Julie, who's doing more important things, taking care of her kids. So if you can join me in giving, I'll do a loud clap here. It'll be mime for everybody else. But if we can close this down and move over to the little farewell session, I've got some questions I want to put to you, and we'll go on to next steps. So thank you very, very much.
Thanks to everyone.
Thank you for organizing.